November 1944. Midori Takahashi stood on the deck of a military transport, watching the California coastline emerge through morning fog. Everything she had been told about America promised brutality, torture, starvation. Within weeks, she would discover something far more disturbing than cruelty. A prison camp that looked like a town, guards who followed rules, and an enemy that fed her children while fighting hers. Late November 1944. The Pacific War raged in its final, bloodiest chapter. On a gray military transport ship approaching the California coast, 32-year-old Midori Takahashi pressed her 7-year-old son Kenji close to her side. Around them, 24 other Japanese women and children huddled in silence, their faces hollow with exhaustion and fear. Midori had been detained 3 months earlier in the Marshall Islands, where her husband had worked as a civilian administrator before the American advance swallowed the territory. The interrogations had been brief, professional, devoid of the violence she had braced herself to endure. Now, after weeks at sea, she was arriving on enemy soil itself. The propaganda broadcasts from Tokyo had been clear and consistent throughout the war. Americans tortured prisoners. They starved captives. They violated women and murdered children. The imperial government had warned all Japanese civilians. Capture meant death or worse. Better to take one's own life than fall into American hands. Midori had not taken that final step. Kenji had been sleeping beside her when the American soldiers arrived, and maternal instinct overpowered indoctrination. She had surrendered quietly, expecting execution within hours. Instead, they had given her water and directed her to a processing tent. Now, watching the California coastline solidify through the fog, she wondered if the propaganda had been correct after all. Perhaps the Americans simply transported prisoners to the homeland before the real horrors began. Her hands trembled as she smoothed Kenji's hair. The ship docked at a military facility south of San Francisco. American sailors secured the moorings with practiced efficiency. Midori noticed their youth, many barely older than boys, their faces sunburned and tired. They did not look at the Japanese detainees with hatred, only with the blank professional disinterest of men performing routine duty. An officer with a translator called out instructions in accented but comprehensible Japanese. The detainees would disembark in groups of 5. They would proceed to the processing building. They would cooperate fully. Violence would not be tolerated, but neither would resistance. Midori's group descended the gangway. Her legs shook after weeks of shipboard confinement. An American military policewoman, middle-aged and stern-faced, gestured them toward a low concrete building. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The room smelled of disinfectant and coffee. Processing took 4 hours. Names, ages, origins, family connections. A nurse examined Kenji for communicable diseases, her touch gentle and professional. A doctor checked Midori's eyes, throat, reflexes. They were given sandwiches. White bread with processed cheese, strange and bland but substantial. Kenji ate ravenously. Late that afternoon, the detainees boarded a passenger train. Not a freight car, not a prison transport, but an actual passenger train with cushioned seats and windows. Armed guards stood at each end of the car, but they did not bind the prisoners or restrict their movement within the designated space. The train rolled east through California's agricultural valleys. Midori watched endless fields of crops, worked by Mexican laborers and white farmers. The American heartland was vast, untouched by war, impossibly productive. Japan's cities were being incinerated by B-29 raids, its people starving, its empire collapsing. Here, the land stretched rich and peaceful under autumn sun. Other passengers occasionally walked through their car, civilian Americans traveling on ordinary business. Some glanced at the Japanese detainees with curiosity or discomfort, but most simply passed through, focused on their own concerns. The normalcy was more disorienting than hostility would have been. After 3 days of travel, the train reached Texas. The landscape transformed into flat, arid scrubland, dotted with mesquite and pale grass. On the morning of the 4th day, they arrived at Crystal City, a small town near the Mexican border that Midori had never heard of. A fleet of buses waited at the station. The guards were polite but firm as they directed the detainees aboard. A 20-minute drive brought them to a gate flanked by guard towers and topped with wire fencing. A sign read, "Crystal City Internment Camp, U.S. Department of Justice. The bus passed through the gate and Midori's breath caught. She had expected a prison yard, muddy and brutal, with barbed wire and watchtowers dominating a landscape of suffering. Instead, she saw rows of neat wooden cottages, painted white and arranged along gravel streets, gardens with vegetables, a building that looked like a school, children, Japanese and German, playing in a fenced recreation area. This was not what Tokyo had promised. This was not torture and starvation. This was something else entirely. Something her propaganda-shaped mind struggled to categorize. A prison that looked like a town. Captivity that resembled ordinary life. Constrained and supervised but fundamentally organized around routine normalcy. The processing building stood at the camp center, a two-story administration complex flying the American flag. Inside, Department of Justice officials sat behind desks with typewriters and filing systems. A Japanese-American translator, a Nisei woman in her 20s, greeted the new arrivals in fluent Japanese. More paperwork, more questions, medical histories, work experience, family contacts. An official explained the camp rules in methodical English, translated sentence by sentence. Detainees would be assigned housing by family unit. Single women would share cottages. Children would attend camp school. Adults could volunteer for work assignments paid in camp scrip. Mail could be sent and received, subject to censorship. Religious observance was permitted. Violence, escape attempts, and refusal to cooperate would result in disciplinary action. The translator saw Midori's confusion and spoke to her directly. This was not a military prison camp. This was a civilian internment facility operated by the Department of Justice, housing Japanese, German, and Italian civilians deemed security threats or detained for diplomatic exchange purposes. The facility operated under guidelines consistent with the Geneva Convention, inspected regularly by the International Committee of the Red Cross. Midori understood the words but could not reconcile them with her expectations. The Geneva Convention was for soldiers, for honorable combat between civilized nations. Japan had not ratified the convention, considering its provisions incompatible with Bushido principles. Yet here was America, applying its standards to enemy civilians, to women and children who posed no military threat. A camp administrator, an older woman with gray hair and glasses, led Midori and Kenji to their assigned cottage. It was a simple wooden structure with 2 small rooms, a bathroom with running water, and a small front porch. The furniture was basic but functional. Beds with mattresses, a table, chairs, a small stove. Clean sheets and blankets were stacked on the beds. The cottage smelled of fresh paint. The administrator explained the daily routine. Breakfast at 7 in the communal dining hall. School for children started at 8:30. Work assignments began at 9 for adults. Lunch at noon. Recreation time in the afternoon. Dinner at 6. Lights out at 10. Weekly movie screenings in the camp theater. Religious services on Sundays. Monthly visits from Red Cross inspectors. Midori stood in the center of her assigned cottage, holding Kenji's hand, trying to process what she was being told. This was imprisonment, certainly. The fences and guard towers made that clear. But it was imprisonment structured around order, routine, and basic human dignity. It was not the hell Tokyo had described. That first night, Midori lay awake on an actual mattress, listening to Kenji's soft breathing beside her. Through the window, she could see streetlights illuminating the gravel paths between cottages. A guard walked a patrol route, his footsteps crunching rhythmically. In the distance, she heard laughter from one of the other cottages, Japanese voices speaking freely. She thought of her husband, somewhere in the Pacific Theater, possibly dead. She thought of her parents in Hiroshima, living under American bombing raids. She thought of everything she had been taught about the enemy, about American barbarism and racial hatred, and she thought about the sandwich she had been given on the ship, the nurse's gentle hands examining Kenji, the cottage with running water and clean sheets. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. She had been prepared to die. She had been prepared to watch her son die. She had not been prepared for this measured, bureaucratic captivity that provided meals and schooling. Morning came with a bell that rang across the camp. Midori dressed Kenji in the clean clothes that had been provided, simple but adequate garments in American style. They walked to the dining hall, following other families along the gravel paths. The dining hall was a large wooden building with long tables and benches. A serving line offered rice, eggs, vegetables, bread, milk. The portions were adequate, not generous but not starvation rations. Midori noticed German families sitting at separate tables, their children speaking German to each other. Italian families occupied another section. The segregation was informal but evident. After breakfast, Kenji joined other children heading to the school building. An American teacher, a middle-aged woman with a kind face, greeted the students at the door in English. A Japanese assistant teacher translated for the newer arrivals. Midori watched her son disappear into the classroom, feeling the strange dislocation of seeing him enter enemy education. Midori reported to the work assignment office, where a camp administrator reviewed her background. She had worked as a clerk before the war, so they assigned her to the camp administration office, filing documents and maintaining records. The pay was 10 cents per hour in camp scrip, usable at the camp store for personal items, toiletries, snacks. The work was mundane, bureaucratic, exactly the kind of paperwork she had done in civilian life. Her supervisor was an American woman who spoke no Japanese but communicated through gestures and simple English phrases. The woman was neither cruel nor particularly kind, simply professional, treating Midori as one would treat any clerk performing routine tasks. During lunch break, Midori sat with other Japanese women in the dining hall. They spoke in hushed voices, sharing their confusion. One woman, older and more educated, had been detained in the Philippines. Another had been arrested in Peru and transported to American custody through a complex diplomatic arrangement. A third had lived in California before the war and spoke fluent English. The California woman, Sachiko, explained what she knew about the American system. After Pearl Harbor, all Japanese Americans on the West Coast had been removed from their homes and placed in War Relocation Authority camps, different from these Justice Department facilities, but similarly structured around containment rather than punishment. The legal distinction was murky, the constitutional justification controversial, but the practical result was mass incarceration based on ethnicity and presumed security threat. But even in this incarceration, Sachiko explained, the Americans maintained certain standards. They fed prisoners adequately. They provided medical care. They allowed religious practice. They permitted education. The cruelty was in the loss of freedom, the destruction of lives and communities, not in deliberate physical suffering. Midori asked the question that haunted her. Why? Why did the Americans fight a brutal war in the Pacific, facing kamikaze attacks and suicidal resistance, yet treat prisoners with this measured correctness? Why did they follow international conventions that Japan itself rejected? Sachiko had no answer, only observations. Perhaps it was American self-image, the need to see themselves as civilized liberators rather than conquerors. Perhaps it was pragmatic reciprocity, protecting American prisoners by establishing precedent. Perhaps it was simply bureaucratic momentum, the machinery of law and regulation operating even during total war. That afternoon, Midori attended a mandatory orientation session in the camp theater. A Justice Department official explained the facility's purpose through a translator. The United States was at war with Japan, Germany, and Italy. Citizens and nationals of enemy countries residing in American territory represented potential security threats. This facility detained such persons until they could be repatriated or until the war's end, whichever came first. The official emphasized that detainees were not prisoners of war in the military sense, but civilian internees held for security purposes. They retained certain rights: communication with family, religious practice, education for children, medical care, protection from abuse. In exchange, they were expected to cooperate, follow camp rules, and cause no disturbance. The official also mentioned that the International Committee of the Red Cross inspected the facility quarterly, interviewing detainees and examining conditions. Any complaints could be reported directly to Red Cross representatives, who operated independently of American authority. After the orientation, a projector screen descended and the camp showed a film. It was a Hollywood musical, frivolous and colorful, dubbed in English with no translation. The Japanese detainees watched in confused silence as American actors sang and danced across the screen. The juxtaposition was surreal: imprisoned enemy civilians watching American entertainment, provided by their captors as a form of recreation. Kenji emerged from school that afternoon chattering about his day. He had learned English words: hello, goodbye, thank you, please. The teacher had given him paper and crayons. He had played with other children during recess, Japanese and German and Italian kids finding common ground in games that required no shared language. Midori listened to her son's enthusiasm with mixed emotions. He was adapting, as children do, finding normalcy in abnormal circumstances. He was learning the enemy's language, being shaped by enemy education. Yet he was also safe, fed, healthy. The maternal calculation was brutal in its simplicity. Better alive and Americanized than dead and pure. Weeks passed into a rhythm. Wake, breakfast, work, lunch, recreation, dinner, sleep. The routine was numbing but also stabilizing. Midori's filing work was tedious but undemanding. Kenji progressed in his English studies. The winter weather in Texas was mild compared to what she had known in Japan. Cool, but not bitter. The camp store sold items purchased with work scrip: soap, toothpaste, writing paper, stamps. Midori saved her earnings to buy Kenji small treats, candy bars, and comic books in English that he couldn't fully read but enjoyed for the pictures. The act of shopping, of making small consumer choices, created an illusion of normalcy within captivity. In December, the camp administration allowed Christmas celebrations for the Christian detainees, both German and Italian families. Midori and the other Japanese observed from a distance, watching the Christmas tree erected in the camp square, hearing carols sung in German and Italian. The separation between groups was maintained, but the principle was evident. Cultural and religious practices would be accommodated where possible. When January arrived, the administration extended the same accommodation to Japanese New Year traditions. They provided rice for mochi making, allowed families to gather for traditional foods, permitted the display of New Year decorations. The gesture was small, but its significance was profound. The enemy was allowing, even facilitating, the preservation of Japanese culture within captivity. Midori participated in the New Year preparations with other women, pounding rice into mochi using improvised equipment. The physical work was familiar, comforting, connecting her to traditions that stretched back generations. Kenji watched with fascination, absorbing culture that American schools would not teach him. An older man, a Buddhist priest detained from Hawaii, conducted informal ceremonies in one of the cottages designated for religious use. The Americans provided the space and privacy, asking only that gatherings remain orderly and non-political. Midori attended, finding solace in familiar prayers and rituals, the continuity of spiritual practice despite physical displacement. In late January, the International Committee of the Red Cross conducted its quarterly inspection. 2 representatives, one Swiss and one Swedish, toured the facility with translators, examining housing, food services, medical facilities, and work conditions. They interviewed detainees randomly, asking about treatment, complaints, concerns. When they spoke with Midori, she struggled to articulate her experience. She had no specific complaints about abuse or deprivation. The food was adequate. The housing was basic, but weatherproof. The work was fair. Medical care was available. Yet she was still imprisoned, still separated from her husband, still uncertain of her future or her family's fate in Japan. The Red Cross representative, a middle-aged Swiss man with careful English, listened and took notes. He explained that conditions in Crystal City were consistent with international standards for civilian internment. The facility met Geneva Convention guidelines, even though the United States was not technically required to apply those standards to civilian detainees. The decision to do so reflected American policy choices and diplomatic considerations. Midori asked if he had visited Japanese prisoner facilities, if American soldiers captured in the Pacific received similar treatment. The representative's face tightened. He had visited some camps in Japan, he said carefully. Conditions varied. Then he moved to the next interview, leaving the implication hanging in the air. Later, Midori learned from other detainees who spoke better English that reports from Japanese camps were horrific. American prisoners on the Bataan Death March, in camps like Cabanatuan and Changi, faced starvation, disease, torture, execution. The Japanese military treated prisoners with contempt, considering surrender dishonorable and captives unworthy of humane treatment. The contrast was stark and troubling. Midori's own military, her own government, inflicted deliberate suffering on captured enemies. America, fighting the same brutal war, maintained bureaucratic standards and Geneva Convention compliance. The moral calculus was destabilizing. She thought about the propaganda broadcasts, the warnings about American atrocities. They had been lies, or at least exaggerations, designed to prevent surrender and justify Japanese brutality. The Americans were capable of tremendous violence, certainly. The bombing campaigns that were incinerating Japanese cities proved that. But in their treatment of prisoners, they maintained restraints that Japan had abandoned or never embraced. Why? The question consumed her evening thoughts. Was it American hypocrisy, maintaining prison standards while burning civilians from the sky? Was it pragmatic self-interest, protecting American prisoners by establishing reciprocal treatment? Was it genuine moral conviction, a belief that civilized nations maintained certain standards even in total war? Sachiko, the California woman, offered her theory during one of their lunch conversations. Americans saw themselves as liberators, as defenders of democracy against fascist tyranny. This self-image required demonstration, required evidence of moral superiority, treating prisoners decently, following international law, maintaining humanitarian standards. These were the visible proof that American values were worth defending. But Sachiko also noted the bitter irony. Japanese Americans, American citizens born on American soil, had been stripped of their homes and businesses and imprisoned based solely on their ancestry. The very camps holding them claimed to defend democratic values while practicing ethnic discrimination. The gap between ideal and practice was vast. Still, Sachiko admitted, even the WRA camps for Japanese Americans maintained basic standards. Families stayed together. Children attended school. Medical care was provided. The injustice was profound, the constitutional violation clear, but the camps were not death camps, not deliberately designed for suffering and extermination. In March 1945, news filtered into the camp of American victories across the Pacific. Iwo Jima had fallen after horrific fighting. The Philippines were liberated. The bombing of Japan intensified. Tokyo suffered firestorm raids that killed over 100,000 civilians in a single night. Midori absorbed this news with numb horror. Her parents were in Hiroshima, an industrial city that would certainly be targeted. Her husband was somewhere in the shrinking Japanese defensive perimeter, likely facing overwhelming American firepower. The war was clearly ending, and Japan was clearly losing, but the cost was apocalyptic. In the camp, life continued its routine. Kenji's English improved dramatically. He played baseball with other children, learning the American sport with enthusiasm. He sang songs learned in camp school, English lyrics about American themes. He was becoming American, or at least Americanized, shaped by captivity into something hybrid and displaced. Midori noticed other changes too. Younger detainees, teenagers, and young adults who had lived in America before the war gravitated toward American cultural forms. They listened to American music on the camp radio. They read American magazines available in the camp library. They spoke English among themselves, finding it easier than Japanese for expressing certain thoughts and concepts. The older generation resisted more firmly, maintaining Japanese language and traditional practices, viewing accommodation as betrayal. Tensions simmered within the Japanese detainee community, generational divides exacerbated by the strange limbo of captivity. In April, President Roosevelt died. The camp administration announced the news formally, and American flags flew at half-mast. Some detainees felt grim satisfaction at the death of the leader who had ordered their imprisonment. Others felt strange uncertainty, wondering if his successor would maintain current policies or impose harsher measures. But practical conditions did not change. The bureaucratic machinery continued operating. Food arrived, work assignments continued, school sessions proceeded. The system was larger than any individual, self-perpetuating and institutionally committed to its established procedures. May brought news of Germany's surrender. The European war was over. The camp's German detainees received the news with mixed emotions, relief and sadness intertwined. Some hoped for quick repatriation. Others, who had fled Nazi Germany and been detained in America due to technical citizenship issues, hoped to remain in the United States. For the Japanese detainees, Germany's surrender meant only one thing. America could now concentrate all its resources on the Pacific. The end was approaching, and it would be crushing. In June, Okinawa fell after 3 months of savage fighting. Kamikaze attacks had damaged hundreds of American ships. Civilian casualties on Okinawa were catastrophic, tens of thousands dead, many by suicide rather than surrender. The battle demonstrated what an invasion of mainland Japan would cost. Midori understood the implications. If the war continued, if American forces invaded Japan's home islands, the casualties would be unimaginable. Her parents would be in the battle zone. Millions would die. Yet she also knew that Japan would not surrender while the military retained any capacity to resist. The Code of Bushido, the emperor's divine status, the national commitment to fight to extinction, all of this made negotiated peace impossible. In early July, a Red Cross telegram arrived for Midori. Her husband was alive, captured at Okinawa, now held at a military POW camp on the American mainland. The news hit her with overwhelming relief and strange confusion. He had surrendered, had chosen captivity over death, had violated the military code he had sworn to uphold. The telegram provided minimal detail, only his name, rank, and location. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. It mentioned that he was uninjured and that mail communication would be possible under censorship. The International Committee of the Red Cross had verified his status and condition. Midori wrote to him immediately, a carefully composed letter that passed through multiple layers of censorship. She described her and Kenji's situation, the conditions at Crystal City, their health and safety. She avoided political commentary or military discussion, knowing such content would be redacted. She simply told him they were alive, and together, and waiting. Weeks later, his reply arrived, a single page with several lines blacked out by censors. He wrote that conditions at Camp McCoy were tolerable, that he worked in camp agriculture, that he was unharmed. He expressed shame at his capture, regret at his failure to die honorably, but also relief that she and Kenji were safe. The tension between traditional expectations and human survival pervaded every sentence. Other detainees at Crystal City received similar communications from relatives in military POW camps. The men described conditions consistent with Geneva Convention standards: adequate food, medical care, work assignments, recreation. Some camps held thousands of Japanese prisoners, infrastructure built to accommodate the flood of captives as island garrisons fell. Camp McCoy in Wisconsin held approximately 3,000 Japanese POWs by mid-1945, making it one of the largest such facilities in the continental United States. The prisoners worked in agriculture and camp maintenance, received Red Cross parcels, and were organized into internal administrative structures that maintained Japanese military hierarchy, even in captivity. The parallels between military POW camps and civilian internment facilities were evident. Both operated under international standards, both maintained basic human welfare, both were designed for containment, rather than punishment. The cruelty lay in the fact of imprisonment, not in deliberate deprivation or torture. August arrived with unbearable heat in the Texas scrubland. The camp's routines continued, but an atmosphere of anticipation pervaded everything. The war was reaching its endgame. Some resolution was imminent. On August 6th, the camp administration made an announcement. An atomic bomb, a weapon of unprecedented power, had destroyed the city of Hiroshima. Casualties were estimated in the tens of thousands, possibly over 100,000. A second bomb fell on Nagasaki 3 days later. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan. The emperor himself would make a radio address. Midori collapsed when she heard the news. Hiroshima, her parents, her childhood home, everything she had known, vaporized in a single explosion, a weapon so powerful it seemed to belong to science fiction rather than war. Other detainees gathered in stunned clusters, trying to comprehend what had happened. The camp administration provided no details beyond the basic facts, leaving the Japanese community to absorb the implications of atomic warfare in shocked isolation. On August 15th, the emperor's radio address announced Japan's surrender. The war was over. The military government that had ruled Japan since the 1930s, that had launched wars across Asia and the Pacific, that had sustained a brutal occupation and refused to surrender despite overwhelming defeat, had finally accepted the inevitable. The detainees at Crystal City received the news in numb silence. Relief and grief intertwined. The killing would stop, but Japan was destroyed, occupied by foreign troops, stripped of its empire and military power, its cities in ruins, and its population starving. Victory had never been possible, yet the defeat was absolute. Camp administrators explained that repatriation would take time. Ships had to be organized, diplomatic arrangements made, receiving facilities in Japan prepared. Detainees could choose to return to Japan or, in some cases, remain in the United States pending immigration hearings. The latter option was limited and complex, but it existed. Midori faced an impossible choice. Her parents were likely dead, incinerated at Hiroshima, or killed in the firestorm aftermath. Her husband was in American custody but would presumably be repatriated to Japan. Her son was 7 years old, speaking more English than Japanese, Americanized by 2 years of camp schooling. What future awaited them in occupied, devastated Japan? She spent weeks in agonized deliberation. Other detainees made their choices based on family connections, economic prospects, political beliefs. Some wanted only to return home, regardless of conditions. Others saw no future in ruined Japan and sought to remain in America, the country that had imprisoned them, but also fed and sheltered them. Finally, in October, Midori decided. She would return to Japan, to Hiroshima specifically, to search for her parents or evidence of their fate. She would reconnect with her husband after his repatriation. She would rebuild in the ruins, however difficult that proved. Kenji would grow up Japanese in Japan despite his American education and English language skills. The decision felt both necessary and tragic. She was returning to devastation, to poverty and hunger, to a defeated nation under foreign occupation. But it was her nation, her culture, her identity. The 2 years in American captivity had not changed that fundamental belonging. In November, her repatriation group boarded trains for the West Coast. The journey reversed her arrival route, California valleys and coastal facilities, but the circumstances were entirely different. She was leaving as a free person, technically, though returning to a country that was anything but free. At the port, American officials processed the repatriates with the same bureaucratic thoroughness that had characterized her entire detention. Documents, medical checks, lists, and manifests. The machinery of administration turning smoothly, even in the chaos of war's aftermath. The ship was a converted military transport, crowded with Japanese repatriates from various camps and facilities across America. Families, single men from POW camps, elderly detainees, all compressed into the vessel's hold for the Pacific crossing. Conditions were basic but adequate. Rations provided, medical staff available. The voyage took 3 weeks. Midori stood on deck as the ship approached Yokohama, seeing the devastation from the sea. The harbor was choked with sunken vessels. The city beyond was flattened, block after block of ruins. American occupation forces were everywhere, military vehicles and troops moving through the rubble. Processing on Japanese soil was slow and chaotic. The Japanese government, now operating under American supervision, struggled to track and accommodate the flood of returning prisoners and detainees. Food was scarce, housing nearly non-existent, infrastructure destroyed. Midori and Kenji made their way south toward Hiroshima, traveling by whatever transport they could find, often walking. The countryside showed less physical damage than the cities, but the population was starving, struggling to survive on minimal rations and black market trade. Hiroshima was worse than she had imagined. The atomic bomb had created a wasteland, a flattened circle of utter destruction with a few concrete buildings standing like tombstones. Survivors lived in makeshift shelters, suffering from radiation sickness, burns, starvation, trauma. Her parents' neighborhood was gone, vaporized, leaving no trace of their existence. She spent weeks searching for information, asking survivors, checking makeshift registries maintained by volunteer organizations. Finally, an elderly neighbor who had been outside the city during the attack confirmed what she had feared. Her parents had been home that morning. No one in that neighborhood had survived. Midori sat in the ruins and wept. The grief was overwhelming, made worse by the knowledge that she had been safe, comfortable, fed and sheltered, while her parents burned. The camps had protected her from the war's final horror, and she felt obscene guilt at having been spared. Yet she also felt something else, something she could barely articulate even to herself. Gratitude. Not for the bombing, not for the war, not for the imprisonment, but for the fact that American captivity had followed rules, had maintained standards, had kept her and Kenji alive when death surrounded them. She had expected torture and received bureaucracy. She had expected starvation and received adequate rations. She had expected cruelty and received correctness. This was not forgiveness. The injustice of detention remained. The loss of years, the destruction of her family, the atomic horror that ended the war. None of this could be justified or excused. But the fact remained. America had imprisoned her according to legal frameworks and international standards, had treated her as a civilian detainee rather than an enemy to be destroyed. Japan, her own country, had afforded no such standards to its prisoners. The stories emerging from American POWs released from Japanese camps were horrific. Death marches, starvation, torture, execution. The contrast was undeniable and deeply disturbing. In the years that followed, as Japan rebuilt under American occupation, Midori rarely spoke of her time in Crystal City. The experience did not fit easily into post-war narratives. She had been imprisoned by the enemy, yet treated better than many Japanese civilians had been treated by their own military government. She had lost her parents to American atomic weapons, yet owed her life to American prison standards. Her husband returned from Camp McCoy in 1946, repatriated with other POWs, thin but healthy. He adapted poorly to post-war Japan, haunted by shame at having surrendered, unable to find work in the devastated economy. Kenji grew up bilingual, his English from camp school proving valuable as American occupation forces needed translators and administrative staff. In the 1950s, Midori occasionally encountered other former Crystal City detainees, recognizing faces from the camp, sharing brief, uncomfortable acknowledgments of shared history. Few wanted to discuss the experience in detail. It was easier to speak of hardship and injustice than to acknowledge the complex reality of humane imprisonment. Decades later, in the 1980s, an American researcher interviewing former internees found Midori in Hiroshima. By then she was elderly, a grandmother, still living in the reconstructed city that had been atomized around her parents. The researcher asked about her time at Crystal City, expecting stories of abuse and deprivation. Midori spoke carefully, choosing words that had taken 40 years to formulate. The imprisonment had been unjust, she said. The separation from her husband, the loss of freedom, the ethnic classification that made her a security threat despite being a civilian housewife, all of this was wrong and harmful. But the conditions of that imprisonment had surprised her, she admitted. The camp had provided adequacy where she expected deprivation, order where she expected chaos, basic humanity where propaganda had promised cruelty. The guards had been professional rather than sadistic. The administrators had followed rules rather than exercising arbitrary power. The system had operated according to established standards rather than descending into brutality. This was not because Americans were morally superior, she clarified. The atomic bombs that killed her parents proved that America was capable of tremendous, calculated violence. But in the specific context of prisoner detention, America had maintained standards that Japan had rejected. That distinction mattered, even if it didn't justify the broader injustice of internment. The researcher asked if she had forgiven America for imprisoning her and destroying her family. Midori considered the question, then shook her head. Forgiveness was too simple, too complete. What she felt was more complicated. A recognition that enemies could maintain humanity even in war, that legal frameworks could constrain violence even during total conflict, that civilization standards were tested most severely when most threatened. The title of her experience, she said, should be simple and honest. I didn't expect this. She had expected brutality and found bureaucracy. She had expected torture and found routine. She had expected death and found survival. None of this excused the imprisonment or the war or the atomic devastation, but it revealed something about the possibility of maintaining standards even in the depths of conflict. The Americans had built their camps for order, work, and rest, not because they were saints, but because they believed their system required such standards. They had followed the Geneva Convention not from pure altruism, but from self-interest and self-image. They had treated prisoners decently not because war was gentle, but because they saw such treatment as essential to their identity as a democratic nation. Midori lived until 1997, long enough to see the Cold War end and Japan become an economic power. She never fully reconciled the contradictions of her wartime experience: the prison that looked like a town, the enemy that followed rules while dropping atomic bombs, the camps built for order while the world burned. But she remembered. She remembered arriving in California expecting execution and receiving a sandwich. She remembered the cottage with running water and clean sheets. She remembered Kenji learning English in camp school. She remembered the Red Cross inspections and the New Year's mochi making, and the bureaucratic correctness of her captors. And she remembered the ruins of Hiroshima, the shadow of her parents' deaths, the atomic wasteland that defined her life's second half. Both memories were true. Both realities had coexisted. Understanding that contradiction, living within that tension, was the burden of having survived the war in enemy custody. The story of Japanese women detained in American camps during World War II was not simple heroism or simple villainy. It was the complex reality of humane imprisonment, of legal frameworks maintained under pressure, of an enemy that killed your parents from the sky while feeding your child on the ground. Midori's final words to the researcher were these: "I didn't expect this." And that surprise, that fundamental gap between propaganda and reality, remained the central truth of her experience. She had prepared for death and encountered bureaucracy. That single fact, more than any other, defined her understanding of the war and its aftermath. If this story of unexpected historical reality resonated with you, please take a moment to support this channel. Hit the subscribe button to explore more untold stories from World War II and beyond. Your like helps this content reach others who appreciate deep historical narratives that challenge our assumptions. And most importantly, share your thoughts in the comments below. Were you surprised by the conditions in these camps? Do you have family stories from this era? What historical misconceptions have you discovered? Your perspective adds to our collective understanding of these complex events. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.